I'm Jennifer Della Quadri, and this is Subtle Shifts, the podcast where you'll learn how to transform your life from the inside out, one small, meaningful shift at a time. Let's dive in. Welcome back to the podcast. I have a question for you. Are you in the Subtle Shifts community? If you're not, you're going to want to get in there because all this month, the month of March, I am offering free coaching calls. Our first one was last week. A fabulous group of women showed up. We had really good conversation about identity and how our identity has shaped who we are now in good ways and in not so good ways. We coached around topics like perfectionism, overwhelm, burnout, all of the above. And we're going to have more of them in the community. So join over there. It's free. Join the community and you'll have access to the Zoom link. You just hop on if you can make it. You come on, we talk, you can get coached, and it's all free. I really wanted to do this because I know so many of us women feel so isolated in our lives, and we may have good social circles, but not all of these conversations are happening in the social circles. And it's nice to have a community of women who are going through similar things so you don't feel so alone, you don't feel so isolated, and you realize that a lot of what we're dealing with, we share. So click the link down below to join the community. I'd love to see you in there. Now let's dive into today's topic. I invited on the show today Mandy Capehart, who is a certified grief educator. This is a topic that I've wanted to talk about here on the Subtle Shift podcast for a really long time, but I just wanted to find the right person to come in and share their expertise because I have my own experience with grief, and what's interesting about it is that I always had the assumption that grief was losing someone you love, right? Or losing something really profound, like a person or a job or things like that. My grief wasn't tied to that at all. It was the loss of an idea of what I thought my life would be like or what my experience as a parent was going to be like. I didn't know that the things I was struggling with were tied to grief. So I've learned a lot about grief recently, but I also wanted to invite on an expert because I love learning from people who know their topic. And Mandy is so passionate about this. She is the founder of the Restorative Grief Project, and she supports grievers and their communities. And what I love about Mandy's approach is she's educated and she's also speaking from her own personal experiences. She uses somatic therapy, she's a trauma professional, and what I love most is that she also lives in the Pacific Northwest, just like me. So I invited her on today to talk about all things grief. We talk about what it is, how it's important to integrate it into your life. So somatic practices for grounding and things like that we talk about. We also talk about how to be just curious and self-compassionate when you're processing grief and how to take small steps, subtle shifts to transform the heaviness of grief into an integrative experience into your life. So let's go ahead and dive into today's episode with Mandy Capehart. Welcome to the show, Mandy. I'm so happy to have you here and have you share your wisdom and knowledge with my audience. Before we get into the heart of the episode, tell me and my audience a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you do.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Jennifer. My name's Mandy Capehart. I am an author, fellow podcaster. I'm a grief coach and somatic practitioner, and I work with people who are grieving all the different things that we experience in this life and learning how to support themselves in a way that is sustainable and curious instead of critical or linear, which are ways that our culture have really taught us to heal or try to heal and to work through grief, which, as we have learned, minimizing and making things smaller or pretending they're not as impactful as they are is not the helpful way through. So I am doing that one-on-one. I'm doing it in private coaching groups and again through my book, Restorative Grief.
Of course, all of those things are so important. And I wanted to have you on because grief is something that, from my perspective, is so often misunderstood or not addressed appropriately or well enough. So many people, myself included, are struggling with grief and don't even realize that that's what is going on. So my perspective in the past was always grief is like losing a loved one or having a significant traumatic loss in your life. And I realized over time that grief can mean so much more. So could you just share with my audience what grief is? What does it mean? And how does it impact the life? Just kind of get the conversation going around what grief is.
Yeah, like I mentioned, we've been taught culturally, especially in the West, that's my understanding, so I'll stick with that, that grief is attached to a death or attached to something completely life altering in the way they would make a Michael Bay blockbuster movie about it. We have never really, as a culture, given permission to the events day to day that can cause a reaction of grief, which is a natural response to your understanding of the world around you shifting significantly. And so for a child, a significant shift might be moving. A significant shift for a partner might be the death of a loved one or just a breakup. The significant shift for an employee might be getting a different boss. There are all kinds of experiences in our lives that cause us the expressions of grief to appear in our lives, but we don't normalize those things as grief because it feels too emotional or too big or too much of a response when, again, it's a natural reaction to our life not making the same kind of sense that it made yesterday. So the act of grieving, the work of grieving, going through the process of lamenting and expressing ourselves and learning more about why this mattered and why this was traumatizing in some areas, in some ways, is super important to who we are on the other side of loss, because it does change who we are. No matter how big or small it might seem, there are valid reasons that we grieve every single day.
Yeah, that's the description of a significant shift is it really resonates because it's something that's not expected. And of course that can be a death, but there's so many other things that happen in life that cannot be expected that throw us into the I have no control over my situation and therefore I am having a response category. And it sounds like your approach is just very nurturing and grounded and creating space for the person to actually experience the emotions with emotional safety at the same time. Would you say that's, am I on the right
That's
track
a
there?
wonderful observation, because the primary approach that I bring to grief work is to recognize that this is an integrative experience: heart, mind, body, and spirit. And I say spirit meaning if you're a religious or spiritual person, then you have a higher sense of authority. But also, every one of us has a spirit of connection with ourselves and with others. And I think in a Western paradigm, there is no time set aside for grieving. There's too much productivity and too much forward motion that we're trying to constantly engage, that we can't slow down to the state of rest where we then expand and make space within ourselves and our own lives to explore what grief has brought to our lives, or put it a simpler, less charged way, what change has brought to our lives. Because we understand the world through a lens of here and now and close, right? That's how the brain makes sense of information around us. And so when there is a significant change, no matter how significant that seems to other people, if it impacts the way I see the world and my role in it, I need space and permission to explore that and process what that means for tomorrow or for me in a new set of progress forward. So this idea that you can't do grief work without, that you can do grief work without approaching your whole self, it's just a very disembodied way of dealing with humans, which is what we do with people when we're impatient or we're frustrated or we want them to get a task done. We detach them from their full humanity and turn them into little automatons, like, hey, you can do this thing, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or just buck up, buttercup, you can handle it. And we compartmentalize on behalf of someone else. Well, yeah, my approach is you can compartmentalize if you need to in the moments that it's appropriate. That's a coping mechanism that's very helpful at times. But that coping mechanism will not always serve you. And what then? So how can we, instead of relying on that, have more trauma informed and patient and expansive processes and techniques for you to approach yourself with some compassion for the time frame that it takes? And it will take a lot of time, but your intention is super crucial with that time as well.
The the idea that, and this is very Western, and I know the majority of my listeners here are people who are task oriented, perfectionists. I need to do the things. I'm super productive, all of those things.
Yeah.
And so the idea of taking time to I'm just going to settle and process this grief is very hard to access because I myself, and I'm speaking for myself, I want to work my way. Like I want to get through this. You know what? Let's check the boxes. Let's do the things. And there's so much doing that I myself would do, and it's not going to be productive because it's like forced.
Yeah.
And the goal is to just like, I need to get past this. It's uncomfortable and I don't want it in my life anymore.
Yeah.
Whereas it sounds like for you, yes, that's important to compartmentalize and be able to make it through your everyday life, but there needs to be space too for the actual process of feeling the emotions and healing them.
Yeah, I think if we don't learn how to integrate grief work into our daily lives, we run the risk of never approaching it and always putting it on the shelf for tomorrow of I can compartmentalize, like I said, as a coping mechanism in this moment. Maybe I don't want to actively grieve at work, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But if I don't make space for active grief work, and I can explain what that might look like for people too, then I'm not going to give myself permission to explore when things get difficult in another area. So I've then gotten to my 40s or 50s and I'm just piling on moments of I'll get to that eventually. That's why I have clients in their 40s and 50s who are completely overwhelmed by whether it's the state of the world or the state of their own lives, not knowing what to do next because their coping mechanisms finally failed. It's like trying to shove more pickles into a jar than the jar can support. You're like, but it's a pickle jar, right? Shouldn't it hold all the pickles? No, friend. Eventually it becomes too full and we have to get another solution. What an odd analogy I came up with, a pickle jar.
Pickle jar.
That's my life. This is an insight into my brain.
It's funny how the analogies come out.
It really is. That's, you know what? That's what grief work does. It makes you get creative. The idea of integrating grief work into our daily lives, though, is really, really scary. And so with restorative grief, one thing we do is assess like, hey, heart, mind, body, spirit. What's the current pain point? Where's the scale of terror at? Are you overthinking most often? Knowing full well, all of it is connected. Our thoughts lead to our actions, lead to our feelings, and it's a cycle, right? But there's so much more underneath the surface that's causing the thoughts, the behaviors, and the feelings that we have, and that sense of connection and disconnection. And so often we'll start with a very practical task-oriented thing that allows for immediate symptom relief. Like if you're overthinking, let's practice a very gentle move towards a meditation that isn't the 20-minute focus on your breath. Because someone like me can't do that on a daily basis. I'm not going to expect you in the busyness of your life with far less understanding of this to be able to implement that. But we do things that are very small. And then after we have gotten a little bit of success, feeling like, hey, a daily attention to my grief work is possible, even if it's 5 minutes, even if it's 5 hours. It does not matter the duration as long as you're getting toward this comfort level of it's okay to grieve every day and then move on to my next day, as opposed to this idea that I'm going to cry and never stop crying.
Right.
That is a common phrase. That's when we can then invite someone into asking some deeper questions. Why do you think this grief feels bigger than it might have 4 years ago? Why do you think this experience or this is bringing up stuff from your past as well? Like, what's that layer? Because all grief does not have trauma, but all trauma has grief. And what happens is old griefs start to come up, like the ones we've placed on the shelf, when we finally decide we're going to face this thing right in front of us. So for me, when my mom died in 2016, it wasn't that I'd been denying grief events. It's that I had been experiencing life in such a fast pace. I didn't have a lot of time to slow down and really process wow, I have lost people every year of my life. I have been going through fertility issues for years. I just had another miscarriage. We finally had a baby, and now my mom's dying. And it just was so many things that came to a head. It took me recognizing I have been pretending to grieve instead of actively doing something that feels like it moves the needle back toward that aligned sense of wholeness for me, that heart, mind, body, spirit integration, knowing that it's not static. I'm not going to achieve integration status and be done, but that I have recognized as a spectrum of grief, I've done the bare minimum to just kind of, nudge myself a little bit towards center. And that relief has been enough. Well, it's not enough anymore. So now it's a matter of really investigating, what am I bringing to this conversation now? What am I bringing with me, and how do I tend to that version of me too? I know that's a big overview of what daily grief work can look like, but the idea being those little tiny steps. I mean, What About Bob was one of the most brilliant movies, because baby steps really do make a big difference when we are trying to move back toward this sense of self, or rediscover or even redefine what a sense of self might look like that feels really safe.
Yeah, and the gentleness of letting it just be small, and that's the whole my whole podcast is about subtle shifts, and that's what it is. It's a subtle thing, because so often it can feel overwhelming, like I've got this grief, and if I allow it in, it's going to consume me, and I'm never going to find my way back, and that feels so scary.
Yeah.
But to make it accessible, and you mentioned What About Bob, but in my head I was thinking of the show Shrinking. I don't know if you've
Yeah.
seen that. Okay,
Fantastic.
amazing. And the whole allowing yourself 1 minute, I think it was 1 minute, to just grieve and cry, and then you pull yourself together.
Yeah.
It was funny in the show, but it's also it doesn't have to be you open the door and the door is open and you will never come back. It's you give yourself these opportunities to allow in and process to the extent to which you're available that day, and then allow to slowly move out.
Yep.
Tell me, because I know you have a background in somatic therapy and also yoga and mindfulness. If you wouldn't mind, are there a couple of strategies or techniques that you find to be helpful with your clients when they are doing these small daily check-ins?
Yeah. So the foundation of what we look for is creating safety, security, and belonging in the individual anytime they're going to do any kind of grief work. So safety being, do I have physical and emotional safety here in this space with myself right now? Security, is it lasting? Can I trust it? Will it remain? And belonging, do I belong to myself in that I am not trying to form myself or shape to someone else's expectations? Can I just be me and be comfortable with that? So anytime we approach grief work, we set the foundation for that within the person's self. And often that comes through somatic practices of regrounding and recentering in the body, because the body can only be right here. Our brain and our memories and our thoughts can take us to past moments. We can have physical responses to a past memory, but the body is still here in the present moment. And so when you do things like bilateral stimulation, even going for a walk is one of my favorite ways to say, you want to do grief work, go for a walk and give yourself permission to cry while you walk. Don't worry if anyone sees you. No one will be close enough to see your tears.
Yep.
Sometimes we'll use a little butterfly hug where we're reaching across and squeezing and alternating our hands. Emotional freedom tapping, EFT is actually, or freedom technique is actually a fantastic somatic practice that people, of course, their entire lives have been changed using it. There are so many ways. That one's a little more difficult and advanced for people to learn right off the bat, but it's also one of many, many things that we can do that really bring us into that moment and remind our body, hey, we're here right now. I think what gets complicated when we talk about somatic practices is we're asking the attention of the mind to come into the moment as well. That's what's so scary. I had a friend the other day who said, I'm glad meditation works for you. It doesn't work for me. And she let me ask questions about, well, why is it? What part of it is too difficult, inaccessible, too much? What don't you love? And she said, I just can't slow my brain down. I cannot clear my mind. I cannot come into the moment. I can't focus on my breath. And I said, I understand that. You can hear my rate of speech. I go 1,000,000 miles an hour. I am always thinking about something new and exciting and next. So when I practice meditation, it has not become this exercise in a blank slate. It is, let me see if I can mentally say the word in when I breathe in and mentally say the word out when I breathe out. And if I can do that either audibly or in my head, I have done it. I have
Yeah.
meditated. I have brought my attention to my breath. And we have this idea that these exercises have to be 30 minutes, an
Yeah.
hour, big, long, intensive sessions. We don't live lives that are predisposed to that. We're not living in monasteries. We don't have the luxury of the simple single life necessarily, where we have no obligations or responsibilities. But we do have 3 minutes, and I say this often, to hide in the car and see if we can just notice what the car feels like around us. Is this a safe container to be in right now? Can I trust that for the next 3 minutes, I can be in this car? Would it
Yeah.
be better to move my car around the block so my family doesn't come to the garage and find me sitting in the car concerned and disrupt my
Uh-huh.
2 minutes, right? There are creative, incredible ways we can come to make space for ourselves. And I think about that shrinking scene. I think it's 10 minutes almost that she
Is it
goes
10?
for
Okay.
crying. I can't remember exactly, but I have had people ask me, well, what about that is even possible for me? She's a teenage girl. Like,
Oh.
of course, her life is simple. I love being able to say, you have spent inordinate amounts of time standing in the shower, under the stream of water, doing nothing but feeling the water. You are
Yep.
meditating, my friend. You are
Yep.
allowing your body to be present in the moment. Always hide in the bathroom. Big fan of making the excuse hide in the bathroom, because someone that's going to challenge you about why you're in the bathroom is not common, right? Most people are pretty shy about saying, what's wrong?
Uh-huh.
Just let yourself have that permission to make a little bit of space here in your
Yeah.
car. I had one client that I said, after work, if you feel like you're rushing the door, then take 15 minutes and stop at the
Yeah.
coffee shop, even if it's just to sit in the parking lot. Don't
Mm-hmm.
even go to your house if you need that margin, because your brain needs the chance to transition between tasks anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are using breath work or meditation or anything around that, and you have safety, you deserve space to do it without visual disruptions of, well, that's the door to my house and I know I need to start dinner and my
Right.
family's in there. It's okay to be a whole human and independent of your responsibilities outside of the tasks that you want to accomplish.
Yeah, and it's so true that there's just this misconception that meditation means sitting in stillness for 20
Yeah.
minutes.
Yeah.
And that's not accessible for most people, especially
Yep.
high performing perfectionists and overachieving,
Yeah.
busy parents and moms.
Yeah.
And it's true, creating a container of safety, even if it's your own shower or your own bathroom or in your own garage, where you are present. And then being patient with the amount of time that you have available for that presence. Even if it's 1 minute, it's the intention of, I'm setting it aside for myself.
Yeah.
And what I'm hearing from you is offering like a tool belt. Here's like a tool, a list of tools. Find some that work for you and let that be part of your practice. There's no
Yeah.
wrong way to do it.
I think that's crucial. There is no wrong way to grieve. Are there harmful ways? Sure. Are
Yeah.
we going to move toward harm reduction? Yep. You betcha, as fast as possible. But that doesn't mean that we are judging or shaming or limiting or criticizing ourselves to do it. It means we are asking the question again, what's the foundation behind the behavior? Are we drinking to numb the feeling of experiencing our grief? Okay, when did that start? Because
Yeah.
it might have started a long time ago as a solution to something else. And we just
Right.
thought this is the right move. There was a time in my life in 2019 and 2020, I was dealing with insane stuff. And I realized I was coming home from work every day and making a mixed drink, and it became a habit. I got to the point where I would walk in and my brain, my body already knew and started making it. I didn't even want it. I would make it and dump it out. And it was a moment of like, whoa, this is a fascinating exploration of my automatic behaviors, but this didn't start with this job. This started with something else when that was the solution, to get just a little bit inebriated to take the edge off. And so now, being sober for quite a while at this point and recognizing that wasn't a quick change. That was that actually change came from something else completely, but recognizing there are automatic behaviors that we are used to And we don't necessarily have to indulge them just to try and move toward a softer way of experiencing the world around us, because it is full of sharp edges. But that capacity that we create with little moments towards ourselves is building up a stronger resilience and a resolve toward ourselves for the next task. So when we demonstrate resilience, it's not that we got to the end of this event and we're not marked up or bruised. It's that we continued to be with ourselves in the middle of the event. That is resilience. That is this active resilience that we can then say, oh, I'm breathing through this moment of wanting to rip my so-and-so's head off for what they just said. That is resilience. Being able to stay with yourself and remain. That's meditation. That is being present. That's all those beautiful moments. Even if you're noticing your breath, that's somatic work. That's just inviting your body into the part of it. That is reintegrating all these parts, mind, heart, body, spirit, that in grief just flee to the edges. That's the invitation back to this place of alignment with who we are.
What a beautiful way of describing it. It sounds more accessible, the way that you are explaining. And there is a process of grief that I've heard of and that I know of. And sometimes people don't realize that what they're feeling is grief. They just know that they don't feel good. Like maybe they feel depressed, or they feel like they lack energy, or they're turning to habits like drinking or shopping online to numb or dull. And so it sounds like the idea is just to have those regular check-ins with curiosity with yourself.
Yeah.
Like, what's going on? What am I feeling? What do I need?
Yeah. Yeah, curiosity has become one of my favorite tools to invite people into. I will tell them, I say probably every day, oh, I wonder what that is. Because having the willingness to ask ourselves a hard question, and it is inevitably a very hard question, I wonder what this is a brave thing to do. It's courageous. That itself is resiliency. And when we are experiencing difficult emotions, uncomfortable emotions or situations, when we are not equipped because the people around us weren't equipped, it can feel like we are biting off more than we can chew. It can feel like this is impossible, and I'd like to do the high performer thing and get it done immediately. I'd like to skim the book instead of reading it so that I can say I've read the book. But then what happens with that is we can't recall what we read. So that idea of really gently just offering ourselves permission to wonder without criticism, without condemnation, is going to build our capacity for self-compassion, which says, hey, it sucks that you've been acting in this response to, or having this response to conflict since you were a child. But you weren't really modeled a great conflict resolution practice. And that's not necessarily your parents' fault. And that's not necessarily their parents' fault, right?
Yeah.
It is not a single line of blame that we can lay that then says, oh, that's why I grieve. No, you grieve because you're human and because something has changed and you expected it to not change. That is okay. Your
Yeah.
expectations were unmet in a realistic way. And now you can become curious about how uncertainty, which is the most difficult part about grief work for people, how uncertainty might actually be a safer place for you to exist than trying to live beholden to certainty.
Wow. Even just thinking about living with uncertainty brings up like
All
a
the
little,
bubbles.
"Ooh, I don't know about that." But you know what? The only constant is change. And that's the more you can gracefully anticipate and or roll with the change, the more compassionate you can be with yourself, with the people around you, and the more fulfilled you're going to feel in life.
Yeah.
Because the truth is, the purpose is not to have a life where you don't ever feel bad feelings or negative feelings. It's to where you have the self-trust to know that you can have those feelings and still be a whole person
Yeah.
and still access happiness and joy as well.
Yeah. Well, and that's one thing I've heard it said many times. If you tamp down joy, you're tamping down sadness. If you tamp down sadness, you're tamping down joy. They are related. They are part and parcel, and trying to divest one from the other is what got us here in the first place. It's why people cannot perceive of positive thoughts without the toxic positivity that says good vibes only. We
Yeah.
only accept the good vibes. Well, then you are missing out on the fullness of what life and your version of goodness is extremely limited in its expression. Yeah.
You're like, let me get on my soapbox real quick because I have a
I
lecture to deliver.
backtracked for a second, knowing full well we don't have 6 hours.
I know. There's so much more. So, really, what I'm hearing, and it's out, first of all, let me just say, having a conversation with you is very grounding. So, I can imagine the clients that you work with feel so held and safe just through this conversation. It's very apparent.
I'm so grateful.
And all of it is just done with compassion, curiosity, and patience. So much patience. And as you go through the process of grief and things happen that aren't expected, you have your tool belt, you have resources, things to help ground you, knowing that sometimes you're going to be thrown off and you're going to have really heavy emotions, but that doesn't mean it's always going to be that way. And there are ways to bring yourself back into balance when you feel like your nervous system has been really set off. And that's what all of that embodied work that you're talking about comes in. And the approach that you're talking about it really sounds very grounding and very accessible.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And that is the goal, to create a different tone around grief work, because the word itself is so overwhelming. It's scary. Nobody wants to be grieving. Nobody wants to sit and talk with a grief coach about all the things that make them feel heavy. And I get that. I also know that you have to talk to someone. It does not have to be me. But community is where we find healing. We cannot expect to heal in isolation, because we grow, we are hurt, we are healed, we connect in community. We were built for it. So this need within us to share our story, but first to learn how to tell it to ourselves, to learn what the story is, what are the details. Not that we get the facts correct 100% of the time, but that we are, again, just curious about what these pages hold, what stories we're telling ourselves, and how we can trust those pieces, but also question them in a way that allows us to learn something new about ourselves. That is the place where the magic happens when it comes to grief work. That's the actual meat of meeting with yourself in the middle of that busy, scary, overwhelming, like demanding life that we lead. Slowing down means we're going to see some beautiful things along the way. And we might see some heavy things too. Great. There are both and everywhere we go. And pretending otherwise has really left us shallow as humans and shallow in our connections and shallow in our, you see it now, this recent generation of ghosting constantly in relationships, whether it's brand new or longstanding. That's a fear of confrontation and a fear of the grief work that comes with it, and the honesty that we deserve for ourselves and others. I usually don't stand by the idea of closure, but I also, that's a whole nother conversation, but I also recognize that with some humility and emotional maturity, closure might be possible. There might be an opportunity to have a conversation or multiple that bring us to a state of, okay, I agree. This is ending and I will be okay. Kind of a state.
It's a willingness to be uncomfortable, maybe
Yes.
have some uncomfortable conversations, feel some uncomfortable feelings, and know you're still going to be okay.
Yeah. Discomfort is, it's akin to the uncertainty. People don't want it. People think there's a way around it to avoid it. We constantly are doing things. I have an appointment later today where I need to take documents with me. And after I read the list, I was thinking, okay, I'm sure I have everything I need. And then kind of giggled and thought, but if I don't, I can be flexible. I can look at a list that says, bring these 3 documents, have those 3 documents in my hand. And because of anxiety or untended grief, wonder if I have the right things.
Uh-huh.
That is a lived experience of mine and many people's. But I can also say, I am certain enough, and I will be okay if I have to be flexible.
Yeah.
Being able to practice flexibility in small ways, like not bringing the right documents to an appointment and
Yeah.
then not melting down at the people telling me I have the wrong things,
Yeah.
right? That feels, maybe that's not a small thing. Let me try again. Being flexible that the wrong type of mustard is in the fridge for your sandwich and being
Okay.
okay using Dijon instead of yellow
Mhm.
mustard creates again resiliency that we can bounce back so that when we're facing someone saying you're wrong, we are not immediately in the defensive, addicted to our certainty and willing to harm someone else to protect our own ego and sense of self. Now we're going, I have so many different
I
conversations I'm
know.
happy
There's
to have.
so much that we could talk about and
But
dive into with that.
yeah, but and that's really what it is. It's recognizing a moment of uncertainty. Is this sandwich still going to be satisfying if it has the wrong mustard on it?
Yeah.
Versus, am I still going to be whole and enjoy this life if I lose this person? The
Mm-hmm.
answer is yes to both things, unless we are rigid, unless we are
Yes.
trapped and addicted to certainty and have placed our belonging on our relationship with someone else and placed our
Yeah.
security connected to that person being here always. I mean, that's kids with parents, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
no matter the age.
Mm-hmm.
That's so many scenarios where we have allowed our relationships to intermingle with our identity instead of being a whole person here, loving and being with a whole person here, and knowing like this, we can't take it with us. But what
Yeah.
can we take with us?
Right. This is also helpful, and I agree. We could probably get into this and talk for hours, but this has been a really good kind of 101
I
how
hope so.
to, and like that's good. It's a perfect place to start. And I know
Yeah.
you have your podcast with lots of episodes and so
Oh,
many
yeah.
things that I'm going to have linked in the show notes so people can
Great.
go and listen to all of your expertise and also your book and all of that as well.
Yeah.
But before we wind up, are there any last minute words or tips that you'd like to share?
I think right now, the atmosphere of Western culture is tense and scary. And because we are people always looking for connection and attunement, it is really easy to assume that we are on the wrong pages or on different pages with people around us, whether it's because of what they say online that we witness, whether we believe differently and see their beliefs in practice versus ours. I think learning that community is key through all of this, knowing full well many of us have lost our communities over the last decade or longer. That doesn't mean we are community less. That means we can then decide, well, what part of community do I have access to create in my own life? What part of connection can I create? Do I have capacity right now to move toward one person instead of five people and ask some questions, right? Do I have the ability to practice that curiosity? And if the answer is no, that's okay. But
Mm-hmm.
that just means that we then practice it with ourselves first. Because if we go toward others when we are dysregulated, especially in conflict, we are already on the defensive trying to avoid a state of collapse on the backside of that confrontation, right? And it becomes confrontation
Yeah.
instead of just a conversation. And so if you find that in this current season, you are dysregulated and uncomfortable at the thought of talking to someone that maybe used to be part of your community or that you would like to return or grow community with, then that work becomes internal. That's where you start. We align with ourselves. That's where grief work gets to show up because we grieve communities constantly.
Yeah.
So that's the inner work. So anyway, that's something I love to do with people is help them recognize, well, what can I do inside my world that would allow me to show up less dysregulated or more open and available for connection with other people, especially when that is crucial right now.
Emotional regulation is at the heart of it all, really. And connection, of course, but it's
Yeah.
easier to have connection when you're emotionally regulated.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really good
And the goal is
reminder.
not to be regulated all the time.
Right.
No one is. And that's a really unfair black and white, like perfectionist ideal
Uh-huh.
that's been applied to grief work too.
Yeah.
The goal of this is not to be regulated. The goal of this is to be aware of our dysregulated states and have ways to bring ourselves back into a more centered, aligned state where we can access who we truly are instead of defending the idea of who we are.
Such a great reminder. And all of this has been so helpful. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your expertise and advice on this sometimes really hard to access topic. But if I know one thing, I know for sure everyone in my audience is experiencing or has experienced grief on some level. Yeah. So these are all really great reminders and strategies for how to move through it with a little more grace and a little less overwhelm. So thank you so much for sharing all that you have shared. And I will have the links to all of your information so my audience can come find you, follow you, and learn from you. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely, Jennifer. Thank you for having me and for knowing that this conversation can change lives.
Great. All right. Thank you, Mandy. Thank you for joining me. If you're ready to take the next step in transforming your life, be sure to subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. And if something resonated with you today, I'd love to hear about it. Share your thoughts, tag me on social media, or leave a review to help others find the podcast. Remember, the smallest shifts can create the biggest transformations. I look forward to hearing from you.